Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. Here we have with us Dr. Agnes Callard, who is a associate professor and director of undergraduate studies at the philosophy at the University of Chicago. She researches ethics and classical philosophy, currently teaching classes on topics such as Plato's dialogues and emotion and moral psychology. Also, she helps run the Night Owls, a late night philosophy workshop, and this year was awarded the prestigious Lebowitz Prize. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Boston Review, and in the Point magazine. She has written the book Aspiration and published many formal journal essays on the topic today, Angry Questions. Without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Callard.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you for inviting me. So there are at least two kinds of questions that we sometimes talk about. One kind of question is a kind where we can agree to disagree, or we can disagree kind of calmly without getting emotional. And the other kind of question is one where we get angry. And I'm interested in kind of exploring with you and getting your thoughts in the Q&A on why it is that we get angry in some conversations and not other conversations, right? Why do some topics, some questions make us angry? I want to start with some passages from some Socratic dialogues that sort of gesture at this distinction of the questions that we get angry about versus the questions that we don't get angry about. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen and show you these passages. Okay, so the first one is from Plato's Alcibiades. Socrates says, "I don't suppose you've ever seen or heard people disagreeing so strongly about what is healthy and unhealthy that they fight and kill each other over it, have you?" Of course not. "But I know you've seen this sort of dispute over questions of justice and injustice, or even if you hadn't seen it, at least you've heard about it from many other people, especially Homer, since you've heard the Iliad and the Odyssey, haven't you?" "I certainly have, of course, Socrates." "Aren't these poems all about disagreements over justice and injustice?" "Yes. It was over this sort of disagreement that the Achaeans and Trojans fought battles and lost their lives, as did Odysseus and the suitors of Penelope." Okay, so disputes over justice and injustice make us so angry that we are prepared to kill each other, right, in a limit case. Okay, now here's another passage from the Euthyphro. "What are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Let's look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is the greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry with each other, or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our difference about this?" We would certainly do so. "Again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ." That is so. "And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled." Of course. "What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine as I tell you whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we're unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do?" Yes, says Euthyphro. I didn't include that part. Okay, so it looks like there are some topics where we can use measurement to figure out the answer. When we differ about numbers, or about the larger and the smaller, the heavier and the lighter. And when we can use measurement to figure out the answer to a question, then we don't get angry about it. So you might say, okay, so the questions that we do get angry about are ones where we can't use measurement to figure out the answer to them, right? But why? Why does the fact that we can't use measurement to figure out the answer to a problem make us get angry about it? How does anger solve the problem, right? Because you might imagine, like, suppose that, you and I disagreed about like how many grains of sand there are on Earth. And suppose that it's just we're never going to solve the problem with measurement. Like, we just don't have tools to get the measurement precise enough. So we can't resolve our dispute. Still, we might not get angry about it, right? It might not make any sense to get angry about it. So it's not just the fact that we can resolve those questions by measurement. It's sort of that the fact that they're the sorts of questions to be resolved by measurement, right? Whether or not we even resolve them by measurement. So I think, okay, well, is it that we like kind of know in principle that these questions about justice and injustice are irresolvable? That can't be what makes us angry. The fact that we know that they're irresolvable, because, you know, I just gave you an example of the sands one that might be, we might know is irresolvable. You might think that certain like questions about taste are irresolvable, like, you know, is chocolate better than vanilla or something? Like there might just be no answer to that question. You like chocolate better, you know, I like vanilla better. We can agree to disagree, right? Sometimes we can agree to disagree and then we don't resolve our dispute. And we're okay with not resolving disputes. A lot of disputes we're okay with just not resolving. We just can just let in some sense, the disagreement stand and we don't get angry. So it's not the irresolvability of the dispute, right? It's not the fact that it's not in fact resolved through measurement. It's somehow that it's the sort of thing that you could do a measurement of that makes us not get angry about it, where, you know, but in the case of taste and ice cream, that's the sort of thing where we can't do measurement either, and we're just okay with it's not being resolved, right? So what's going on here? So I want to suggest that there are some questions that we have that are, in a sense, like load bearing, where a lot of our actions and decisions are based on our answers to those questions. So, you know, questions about like good and bad and right and wrong and just and unjust, we presuppose answers to those questions in acting. So it's really important to us. They underwrite a lot of the things that we do, right? So it's really important to us that we be right about those things. And it looks like when people are wrong about them, or wrong about those things, the harms that are caused by that kind of mistake, we call that injustice, right? So if you and I disagree over whether or not people have human rights or something, right? So we have a disagreement over an ethical question, then, you know, when you act on, say, your belief that there is no such thing as human rights, those actions, we call those injustices. And we get angry over injustice, right? We get more angry over injustice than we would just get angry over some harm that was caused by any other kind of false belief. You could cause harms to people through your false beliefs about how many grains of sand there are, right? But we don't get angry about those. So it looks like there are these questions that are special because we somehow ground our lives on the answers to them. And when people disagree about those questions, right, they're locked in a war over justice. And we get angry about that. And we can get angry enough that we want to, we want to resolve that situation by whatever means necessary, sometimes by means of violence. I want to stop there for a minute and see if there are questions from you guys about what I've just said. And like, I sort of want to go on and talk a little bit about violence and how we should resolve these cases where we disagree about cases of justice. But before doing that, I kind of thought I would stop for if you have questions. Does anyone have a question?
It looks like Q&A is empty.
Okay. Oh, is there let me stop sharing and then I can see. The Q&A is like there's like a special box for Q&A.
Right, but we have somebody who's monitoring it, so when we get
to
Q&A
How about this? If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A immediately, and I'm happy to address it immediately. But let me go on then and talk about, how should we respond? How do we respond and how should we respond? So one thing you might think is that if this picture is right, and if sort of anger is like the mark of a disagreement over a question that really matters to us in a certain way. That's what the anger and the, let's say, unfriendly disagreement, right? That's what it signals, is that this really matters to us. Then anger isn't a bad thing, and unfriendly disagreements aren't bad, right? Unfriendly disagreements are what happen when we disagree over really important things. So like there's, I think, a big anti-anger culture, you might say, where people are telling you like, don't get angry, have friendly disagreements, right? But friendly disagreements would just be disagreements about things that don't matter. And sometimes we need to have disagreements about things that do matter, and then we get angry, right? So it's not a mistake to get angry. The anger is a correct perception of the fact that justice is at stake. Now, why is it that if this is right, and if like the angry disagreements are the disagreements over the things that really matter, those are the ones we should really be having. We should be focusing on having angry disagreements and encouraging people to have them, right? Why are people so opposed to angry disagreements, right? Why do they want to focus on all the conversations about all the things that don't matter that much? The answer is that people often act badly when they're angry. So anger makes it hard to behave well. And so people are like, look, try not to get angry. Don't be so angry, right? But again, if someone's telling you don't be so angry, what they're saying is don't have the conversations that really matter. That's bad advice, right? But then how should you have them? Well, so the thing about anger is that it's really painful. It's really difficult to be angry. And I think whenever we're angry, we're looking for ways out of the anger. We're looking to stop getting angry. Or like, how can I make this end as quickly as possible, right? And so there are a bunch of bad strategies that people have adopted to end anger. The main one being violence, right? So like, if I kill you, then our disagreement is over. That's a way to end my anger, right? It's a bad way. Our disagreement hasn't really been resolved. I've just kind of eliminated it, right? But I haven't solved it. So I think one of the big reasons why people say don't get angry or don't have angry arguments is that they don't want you to resolve them in the way that the Greeks tried to resolve the disagreement over Paris taking Helen, which is to have a giant war where they kill each other, right? Because if the Greeks and the Trojans have this giant war where they kill each other over the question of whether it was okay for Paris to take Helen or not, that doesn't actually answer the question of whether it was okay for Paris to take Helen or not, right? So a lot of our ways of dealing with anger involve attempting to exit the anger in a form that doesn't actually resolve the disagreement. And that in effect is anytime we want to use force. So anytime you want to use force to resolve a disagreement, what you're really trying to do is use force to exit your own state of anger. And the Socratic line of thought says you shouldn't do that. You should just stay angry and try to actually resolve the disagreement. Right. Okay, let me stop there for a minute. The stuff I've said is pretty controversial, so I want to see whether people have any questions. Oh, so here is, there's a question from Rohan. Let me ask you guys a question. When there are questions in the chat, do the people ask their question in person, like on the screen, or do I just answer them?
You just answer them.
What's written in the chat. Okay. All right, I'll do that then. So Rohan asks, would questions of religion that wars have been fought over be similar to these questions of justice? Yes, absolutely. So questions of religion are like moral, ethical questions, right? So the list that Socrates gave was, we fight over the good and the bad, the just and the unjust, and the beautiful and the ugly. What's interesting is that we don't fight that much over the beautiful and the ugly, right? So the things have changed from Socrates' day. They had more contentious aesthetic culture, we might say. We are more happy to like agree to disagree about aesthetic questions, right? But they drew more of a connection between, say, the aesthetic and the moral in terms of noble, right? So like, you know, is someone noble? Is someone to be admired? And that's something you could fight over. It's something we fight over when we fight over statues and whose statues should remain in public, right? That's a question about, in a way, about the noble. So maybe in a way we do fight about it. We just don't call it fighting about the beautiful. And so these religious wars are wars about ethics, right? They're wars about the nature of God, who is understood by all religious people to be, in some sense, the linchpin of ethics. It's not the case that everyone who has believed in God has understood that way, but everyone who's believed in God and fought a religious war has understood God that way. And so, yeah, a religious war is an attempt to settle an ethical question by the use of force. That's a bad strategy for settling the ethical question, right, is what I'm saying. But, you know, if what I'm saying is right, the same thing is true about, say, World War II, right? People who understand World War II as being, well, we fought for the sake of justice, right, to bring justice to the Germans who were doing all kinds of terrible things. They were making the exact same mistake as the mistake in the religious war. They were trying to solve an ethical disagreement, a disagreement over like whether it's okay to murder a bunch of Jewish people, right, by having a fight, having a war. That doesn't solve the ethical question. It doesn't decide it one way or the other. So all wars, basically, except purely prudential wars, would be cases of making this mistake. Are you saying that we shouldn't agree to disagree and we should keep fighting over? Yes, I am saying that. But it depends, right? It depends on whether the question that we're fighting over really matters or not. So sometimes we have stupid arguments or disagreements with our friends, right? And like we might even get really, really worked up and the friendship might even be at stake over something. And we're like, you know, you might realize like later, like, you know, I was just kind of in a bad mood and that wasn't really about anything. And I was fighting for the sake of fighting, or I was fighting like to vent something. And at that point, it might make sense to agree to disagree. And so what you have to decide is the question that you're fighting over, is it a genuine ethical question? Does it really matter? If it really matters, you should fight over it. But the question that we still haven't really addressed is, how should you fight? Now, what I've said is you can't fight over it by using force. And I mean, in a way, I think I put it this way before. I said you shouldn't, but it's not that you shouldn't. So you literally can't. Like, you can't resolve the ethical dispute by using force. Killing all of your people who disagree with you doesn't solve the ethical question, right? So it's not like a bad means. It's just not a means. It's like you're doing another thing. And what my claim is, what you're doing is trying not to be angry. You're solving like a kind of psychological problem. You know, you have to actually disagree and actually fight the injustice, which is to say, try to persuade the person that they're wrong, or try to learn that you're wrong. Okay, another question. Is the problem of anger causing people to argue or perceive that they're being argued against in bad faith merely an execution issue? Okay. So I think that in political circles, when people are angry with each other, there are a lot of accusations of bad faith. It's almost always the case that both sides accuse the other side of being in bad faith. And you might wonder why this is so common in politics, why everybody thinks that everybody who's disagreeing with them is in bad faith. I think the answer is that accusing your opponent of being in bad faith is yet another bad way to get out of anger. It's like killing them, only you're using a different kind of force. You're not using physical force. What you're saying is they're not seriously disagreeing with me over this question. They don't really think the thing that they say, or they don't really have the opposing view, right? And now, of course, some people might actually be in bad faith, and they might be in bad faith precisely because they don't want to have the disagreement, right? So like a lot of our problems are caused by the fact that we really don't want to have disagreements and we're super afraid of them. And we find anger really, really painful. And so we have a lot of ways out, right? And so one way out is to be in bad faith, and the other way out is to accuse someone of being in bad faith and say, I don't have to actually argue with you. I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to face you. I'm allowed to ignore you because there is no real disagreement. What I'm saying is, at least some of the time, people really do disagree profoundly over issues that are deeply, deeply significant. And there's a little bit of a rhetoric sometimes in our culture saying like, but fundamentally we all agree. And it's like, no, fundamentally we have some real disagreements, and those are super important, and we have to like think them through. The idea that we all agree is a way of saying, oh, I don't have to get into any disagreements, but you probably do. Okay, more questions. Wars don't solve questions, yes, but if you try to punish someone, i.e. Hitler, he fights back. So wouldn't there be a war? What would be the correct way? Great question. Okay. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have tried to kill Hitler or kill all the Germans or many of the Germans who were, in Hitler's army. I think that I'm not arguing that the use of force is always wrong. We often use force to prevent great harms. So for example, if a child were running into a street, I would run and grab the child and use force, right, to prevent them from being run over. Okay. And you might need to use force against the Germans to prevent them from killing more Jews, right? And maybe with Hitler, like the only kind of force to really prevent him from keeping on doing this is like having a big war. So I'm not saying that wars can't be necessary, but they should be viewed as necessary evils. They shouldn't be glorified as occasions for justice, right? They're just attempts to prevent the harms that issue from the disagreement. They don't resolve the disagreement. So, if, and sometimes suppose there's like a really dangerous person, roaming the streets, right? Suppose they were severely mentally ill, right? And so we weren't able to persuade them not to do what they're doing, and they have a gun, right? I think you should probably use force against that person, right? To prevent them from harming other people. But all you're doing there is promoting the value of safety. Right? You're not promoting the value of justice. You're not triumphing over that poor person, right? It's a tragedy. So I think the use of force should be viewed as tragic and sad. And sometimes we have to resort to it. But something we're never doing by using force is establishing justice or resolving a disagreement. Okay, more questions. Do you think arguments over economic policy, tax cuts for corporations versus tax increases for corporations, falls under the just versus unjust category? Great question. So I think, yes, I think this is one of our most kind of intractable kinds of disagreements that we get into are questions over economic policy, because in effect, one side, they're more than two sides, but one of the multiple sides are, let's say, sort of empirically minded economists who are there's just an empirical question over which tax policy will make everybody better off in the long run, right? So they think it's a question that involves weighing and measuring and scientific expertise. That's one group of people. And it's not true that all economists fall into that category, but I would say most of them fall into that category. Then there are other people who are no, this is a question of justice, of right and wrong. We need to redistribute income from the best off to the worst off. And not because that's going to make everybody better off, but because there's a moral principle here, a moral principle that those people don't deserve it and those people do deserve it, right? And so one of the things that's happening in that dispute is that these two parties can't actually agree over whether they're disputing a moral question or not, right? And that's something you sometimes get into, that is one person is thinking, we're just arguing over weights and measures. You guys are being super irrational over here, getting all emotional and overwrought over justice, right? And these people are you guys are blind. You don't see that there's a justice question here. You're trying to just like do math and measure things, right? But that's never going to solve the question of justice. Okay. So I think that at least some economic disputes are like these two groups just like talking past each other, because the one group does not think they're in a moral dispute and the other group does. Okay, more questions. How do you resolve an argument when one party isn't responsive, like when people resort to violence in revolution or protesting? Great question. So, you know, I think that if your interlocutor, if the person that you disagree with over a profound question won't listen to you, you can't resolve the disagreement. It's not possible. And that is unbelievably frustrating. Now, the question, there are two questions that emerge at that point. One is, what should you do? Let's address that one, right? You know, if you think that that person's false moral beliefs are going to lead to harms, then you might be obligated to take actions to prevent those harms. You should think about like all the possible harms that there are, right? So for instance, right, suppose that this person's bad views are going to lead to like 3 deaths, right? And then, but suppose that like there's like 10 deaths, they're going to be caused by like just some natural disaster. At least on the view I'm presenting, you should probably prevent the 10 deaths rather than the 3 deaths, right? Because we're out of the justice game altogether. You can't achieve justice then. That is, you can't resolve the disagreement ethically, right? All you can do is prevent the harms. It's like the case of the mentally ill person, right? And you should, you know, other things being equal, you should try to prevent those harms. But here you should think about the larger space of like all the harms there are out there and prevent the biggest ones. And it might not be the one that happens to be caused by injustice. But the other thing that I want to sort of maybe alert to, the idea of the unresponsive person, is we're very quick to characterize our interlocutors as people who won't listen and who are unresponsive, because then we don't have any responsibility for trying to persuade them, right? And you know, I think that maybe one way to think about this is like, there might, like, in a sense, if you really think that they're incapable of listening to reason, then you think of them effectively as disabled in a certain way. And you should interact with them the way that you would interact with a disabled person, right? And it may be that if you were like, some people are better at interacting with disabled people than others, right? And it may be that if you had the right training and expertise and kind of psychological knowledge, then you actually could get through to them, right? But you shouldn't blame yourself for not having that training, right? But you should understand that's what you're dealing with. If you genuinely think that they're incapable of listening to reason. I think a lot of times that's not what we think. Our judgment that other people are incapable of listening to reason is a defense of our own inability to get them to listen to reason. And you want to be like, it's not that I don't know, it's not that I haven't given you a good argument, it's that it's on your side. You're unwilling to listen, right? And this gets at a question about why does anger feel the way it does? Like, why is anger painful, right? Why do we want to get out of it, right? Like, why does the fact that we can't convince someone about one of these fundamental questions make us feel the way anger feels, sort of hot and painful and like we need to get out of that state, right? And I think that the feeling of anger, it is the feeling of your own failure to know that your own answers to these fundamental questions are correct. So I think that we get angry because we are frustrated with our own, the fact that, like, I can't teach you that the right answer is the right answer. That shows something about me. It shows that I don't know it. And so whenever I'm angry, I'm being forced to face up to the fact that the whole foundations of my life, the moral foundations of my life, are shaky, which doesn't mean that I give them up. It doesn't mean that I think that they're wrong, right? But what it means is that, like, I know that they're not as secure as I thought they were. And if they really were that secure, I would just be able to persuade you, right? That's the truth of the matter. The way I represent that to myself is, oh no, the reason I can't persuade you is that there's something wrong with you and you're like unwilling to listen, right? As I'm saying, that might be true if you're like really disabled, something wrong with you. But if I had a really, really persuasive, truthful, insightful argument, I would give it to you and you would be persuaded. And so we get angry because we realize that we don't know that our most fundamental beliefs are actually true. Okay, more questions. Is revenge justified? Great question. I've written on this, so if you're curious, I wrote a piece on anger for the Boston Review for about almost a year ago. So if you just Google my name and anger, I talk at length about this, but I'll just give you a quick answer. I think, so let me give you two answers. So first, I want to say, I guess, I don't think that revenge ever solves the problem, the ethical problem that the anger is responding to. Okay. So the ethical problem that the anger is responding to is a fundamental disagreement, and revenge doesn't solve that disagreement. So in that sense, revenge isn't justified for the same reason that wars aren't justified, and for the same reason that like politically manipulative rhetoric that's going to persuade your opponents to agree with you by using trickery is not justified. It doesn't actually resolve the disagreement. It just gets people to parrot the thing that you're saying, right? Okay, so revenge falls into that category. I would view revenge as a mechanism we use to escape anger because we find the anger intolerable. Now, is it ever justified? Well, look, what if the anger is really intolerable? Here's what Nietzsche thought. Nietzsche thought, do revenges, but make them small so that you don't stay angry very long, right? Just like, a tiny revenge, right? Because if you build up the anger, maybe it'll like explode into something really terrible. So pragmatically, like maybe revenge might be, it might be better than your other options, right? But it never resolves the question of justice. But I also want to say, having said that so many of our responses to anger are revenge. We just don't call them revenge. That is, we don't use the name revenge for our response to injustice when we like that response. We only use the name revenge when we don't like it. So a lot of our, what we call holding someone responsible for the thing they did wrong is just revenge by another means, right? When a lot of the kind of passive aggressive little things that we do when we're sort of mean to people that we're angry to, that's just revenge by another name. Kind of most of the ways that we get out of being angry, and we do them all the time, involve revenge. So revenge is really widespread. And it's something that we're kind of, it's like a huge, like sort of tool in how we respond to our own anger. And it's just an odd fact that we've chosen not to call a lot of our revenges, so as to make them seem more justified to ourselves. Okay, more questions. How would the philosophy of using force not resolving disagreements interact with the criminal justice system? So I think that it would, if we took this view seriously, this Socratic view that I'm arguing for, it would involve a radical revisioning of the criminal justice system, both policing and prisons. So, if we think that somebody did something immoral, then using force on them could only be understood as a way of protecting other people. That is, it could only be understood as being for the sake of safety, not for the sake of justice. So we couldn't call it the criminal justice system anymore because it wouldn't be achieving justice, right? It would just be called the criminal detention system. Arguably, that's what prison is. It's not a justice system. It's a detention system on this picture. And, one thing is that when we hear that somebody did something wrong, something immoral, like murdered a bunch of people, that makes us angry. And we want to see that person suffer. That's our desire for revenge. And so on this view, again, which you can disagree with, on this view, we've kind of dressed up that revenge as justice, so that when they suffer and we take pleasure in their suffering, we're like, no, this isn't revenge. This is criminal justice. Justice really would be a resolution of the disagreement, right? Where they would come to see what they did as wrong, or we would come to see that it wasn't wrong, right? So we disagree with that person fundamentally, the person who committed the crime. Justice would be a resolution of it. And so, we would, if you took this view seriously, it's not to say that you couldn't use force. It's just to say that you couldn't glamorize your uses of force as being for the sake of justice. And you couldn't dress them up in that way. And we might think, once we came to see that these were not attempts to achieve justice, but only attempts to achieve safety, then questions like, well, okay, but how many harms are being caused by the prison system to the prisoners, to their family, comes into the balance of like the total amount of safety, because there's the safety of the prisoners too, right? So it becomes less obvious that something like criminal detention is justified. So I think it would have radical implications. Okay. Is anger in response to violence, injustice justifiable? And can it be a reasonable basis for developing solutions to violence? So I think anger in response to violence is very justified, because if at least if you're assuming that the person is intentionally trying to harm you, say, right? Because if somebody is intentionally trying to harm me and I think they shouldn't be doing that, then I have a very fundamental ethical disagreement with that person, right? And so I should be angry. So it's absolutely, you should be angry in response to attempts at violence or actual violence. Now, violence on your part does nothing to resolve the problem, right? If I am violent to the person who's violent to me, that doesn't resolve the ethical disagreement. So that's not a reasonable response to the injustice, though it might be a reasonable response to my desire for safety, right? So we would have to separate out, like, what is my reasonable response to violence in terms of my ethical response? There, the answer is anger. And then what is my reasonable response to violence in terms of my prudential desire to preserve my safety? And it might be to run away, it might be to fight back, etc. Right? But running away, fighting back, anything other than talking to the person, basically, is not a response to the ethical features of the situation. It's not a response to the injustice on this view. Okay. What methods can we take to prevent harm if the other party is a lot more powerful than us? So, I don't think that, one method to prevent harm would be to persuade the person that they shouldn't do unjust things, right? And that method addresses both the harm and the injustice, that is the ethical disagreement. I would say that's the best method, right? If we set that aside, so if we set aside the possibility for dealing with and resolving the ethical disagreement, and there what we've done is we've set aside the question of justice. So we're no longer interested in justice. We're not caring about justice. We're not pursuing justice, right? We can't fly under the banner of justice, right? That's the situation that we're in. And then the question is, how do you prevent harm? Well, the answer is same as how you prevent any harm, the same as how you prevent the harm from a tornado. You use force somehow, right? So you might use force by banding together. You might use force by stealth, right? By sneaking up on them when they're not noticing you. You might use forceful, tricky rhetoric on them. But I suppose the underlying thing here is you're not somehow more noble for using force in those tricky ways as a weak person than you would be for using force against somebody who's weaker than you. The use of force is the use of force. And what you're doing is trying to preserve your own life or preserve your own safety. And there's nothing especially like noble or glorious about that. It's not justice, right? But it's understandable. Certainly people want to preserve their lives. but you're not somehow permitted, I would say, you're not ethically permitted to take measures as a weak person that you wouldn't be permitted to take as a strong person. Ethics doesn't depend on whether or not you're the little guy. And maybe that's an important, maybe let me emphasize that point, because I think that here's something I was observing to my students lately. Probably, you know, people who are bullied, people have talked to you about it, right? People have like told you stories of being bullied when they were younger, maybe, or people often represent themselves as being bullied, say in high school. So you probably heard tales, maybe you were bullied, right? Maybe you could tell me such a story. So as you grow up, you'll encounter such stories more and more, people telling you about how when they were younger, they were bullied. And something that I've noticed about this phenomenon of people telling you these stories is nobody ever tells the story of when they were a bully. No, somehow that story doesn't exist. I've never heard anyone tell me, you know, there was this time when I was a bully. And so like, I was sort of puzzled by this, and I would wonder, like, I see all the bullied people, but where are the bullies? Where did they go? Is there some special island? Like I've never met them, you know? And the answer is like, no, of course, we're the same people. The people who are bullied and the people who bully are the same people. It's just nobody thinks of themselves as a bully. Now, why? Well, I think because we think that sort of as the victim, as the weaker party, first of all, you get sympathy, but even more significantly, there are special allowances and affordances. If you're bullied, well, then all bets are off. Then you're allowed to fight back. Then you're allowed to, now your use of force is somehow glorious or justified or brave or good. And I'm saying, no, it's not. It's not any different than the bully's use of force. The use of force is the use of force. If you're bullied and you want to save your skin, that's fine. That's understandable. It's not noble. The noble thing would be to resolve your disagreement with the bully, which would really be a matter of figuring out which of you is the real bully, right? That's the thing we're afraid to do. That's the thing we don't want to do. So we lock ourselves into the thought that I'm the correct one and I'm the bullied one, right? And we don't have that conversation with the bully that would determine which of us was the real bully. Okay, more question. Kinera Mulam asks, I don't know whether you've answered this already, but how do you think we should determine when to use force, or what questions we should ask ourselves? That is such a good question. And I don't really have an answer to it. And, you know, like one definition of the state, of like the government, right? I think it's from Max Weber, but I just can't remember who gave this definition, is that it's a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, right? So like the state is the only body that's allowed to use force, right? So like the government or something like that. And there the idea would be like, well, we have to leave it to our collective, deliberative, democratic process to decide when the use of force is allowed. And that's why it's the state that can use force. But like, that's obviously false, that only the state uses force, right? I use force to prevent my kid from running into the road, right? So the state does not have a monopoly on the use of force, and it doesn't even have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It's obvious that I'm allowed to use force on my child to prevent them from running into the road. And if I saw someone about to shoot a child, I would use force to try to stop them. Again, I would not say that I'm doing anything just or anything noble there. I'm just preventing a harm, right? I'm using a force to prevent a harm in the same way that I use force to prevent a harm if I pull my child out of the road. But so this idea that like, oh, well, we can leave it to the state to decide is not true, right? Because we all have to decide individually when we want to use force. And I think it's especially important once we recognize that in addition to physical force, there's verbal force. So, you know, some of the ways that we talk are just an attempt to say how things are. And sometimes we kind of have a message behind how we talk. Sometimes we're trying to exert certain kinds of influence. And that's a kind of use. And the question, when is that legitimate? Like, when is it okay to use force in how you communicate? Is a really difficult one that I've really struggled with. And so I'll give you like an example. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was asked to sign a petition the cause was good. I believed in the cause of the petition. And it was within my field, academic philosophy. It was like certain philosophers disagreed with other philosophers about something. I thought the first group was right. The second group had already made a petition, right? And now the other group was like doing a counter petition, and they wanted me to sign their counter petition. And I agreed with them. And I'm like, do I sign this petition? I agree with their cause. There's this other petition on the other side. But I don't really agree with petitions. I think a petition is an attempt to use force. That is, when you have a petition, you have like a claim that's made, and you may even have an argument for the claim, but whoever is making the argument doesn't quite think it's strong enough, and they want to kind of push you with the force of all those fancy names. And they're like, don't you want to believe this? Look at all the people who believe it. These are all like pretty famous, important people. So maybe you should believe it too. And that's an attempt to influence what people think, not by giving them reasons. And that's a use of force. And I thought, that's wrong. I shouldn't do that. So I didn't sign it. Not only didn't I sign it, I actually wrote something in the New York Times, which you can look up, in which I argue that philosophers should not sign petitions because we should not be using force to try to persuade people. We should be using reason. And so personally, my own personal judgment is that I have not yet encountered a situation in which it's appropriate for me to use verbal force against people to try to manage a disagreement. That is, I think I have to just deal with the disagreement and try to resolve the disagreement as a disagreement. I have encountered many situations in which I have to use physical force. For instance, with my kids when they run into the road, right? Against babies and children, you use physical force all the time. So I actually find the question of when to use physical force an easier question than the question of when to use verbal force. More comfortable with physical force. But for me, that's partly because of my vocation. So I think if anyone in the world is going to stand there and really believe in the power of reason to resolve disagreements, it had better be me. And so I'm not allowed to use verbal force ever. I have to just try to argue as best I can. But I think you have to answer this question for yourself. The state isn't going to answer it for you. So you have to you have to decide, given your vocation, given the kind of person you are, the kind of person you want to be, under what circumstances are you okay using force? And maybe I add a tiny thing. My husband, when he was in high school, was extremely like misfit, angry kid who got in a lot of physical fights. And he told me that the thing he learned from those physical fights is that the person who wins the fight isn't the stronger one. It isn't the one who's better at fighting. It's the one who's willing to use certain kinds of force. He's like, if you'll stick your finger in someone else's eye, you can win against almost anyone. People are just not willing to do that, right? So there's a question you have to ask yourself: what kinds of force are you willing to use? And what kinds of force should you be willing to use against other people? And I think that's a question each of us has to answer for themselves, though I think we should deliberate together about it. But I think it's a very difficult question. It's a very difficult question to give a universal answer to. That's my answer to how I've answered it. Okay. Anonymous attendee asks, can a philosophy be generalized to explain when anger is justified, or should the use of anger be evaluated on a case-by-case basis? Okay. So I think it's a great question, because in a certain way, it's like, wouldn't it be great if when you and I were angry with each other, there were like some third party, some arbiter from the outside that we could turn to, where they could sort of tell us whether that was a question we should get angry about or not. Notice that that's a lot like the measurement cases in the passage from the Youth of Road that I read you guys, right? So if you and I disagree about the size of this pen, right, we can measure it. What is it to measure it? Well, I would say to measure something is to say, let's set aside our disagreement for a minute and let's like take a ruler and like look and check, right? We'll go check. And then we'll get this answer, right? And that will solve it. And so in order to measure something, in order to go check, we have to be able to, in effect, set aside the disagreement for long enough to go check. We have to be able to sort of hold the question in abeyance. And I think empirically resolvable questions are questions where we are able to do that. We're able to be like, let me not worry about what I think about the length of this pen for a minute. I have to not worry about what I think about it while I'm measuring it, right? Because I'm measuring it, I'm being receptive to thinking something new about the length of it. So I think that with ethical questions, there is nothing like that. There is no art of measurement. There is no external source that we can turn to. And so the only way to figure out whether the question is worth getting angry about is usually to get angry about it, right? That is to engage with the person and try to resolve it. And I think we would love it if there were some other source, you know, some authority, someone that could like figure this out for us. I often actually, like my kids, if they're fighting with each other, they want to come to their parents and be like, okay, like you solve this for us, right? And when you're a kid, you can do that. And when you grow up, there's no one there. There's no third party. There's no parent. There's no state. There's no teacher. No one is there. And there's no, God is there. I believe in God. God is there, but God's not going to help you out. You can ask God. Well, God has never answered me. You just have to figure out those questions for yourself. And the only way to do it, I think you can't figure them out by yourself. That's the thing. That's the frustrating thing. That's the thing that makes you angry, is that there's a deeply important question and you can't figure it out by yourself. And the only person who can help you is the person you're the most angry at, your enemy, right? The person who has the wrong, false, evil view. That's the only one who can help you. So no, I don't think in general there's some shortcut besides having the fight. Though, as I said, occasionally with friends, what can happen is that some reflection can just dispel it and just be like, oh, there wasn't anything there. That can happen. It's sort of in a way lucky. Maybe I'll add to that like, I think though that we can also do a thing where we decide that it wasn't really a big deal and we can agree to disagree when the truth is that we can't, and it is really a big deal and it really does matter. I think we do that all the time too. And usually it just kind of comes back, you know, like later, like we pretended to agree to disagree, but we actually couldn't. So let me just ask Sophia, how long do I have till?
Let me check. We can go slightly over too, since you're the last talk, but technically you end at 2:55.
Okay, so that's 4:55 my time.
Yeah, and that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I wanted to make sure, and it's fine. I mean, at the moment there's only one more question, but I'm just mindful of that. Okay, so anonymous attendee, you mentioned that you dislike petitions as a show of force. What do you think about social media movements? Not necessarily cancel culture, but even just being able to see how many people support a certain cause. Great question. So yeah, I see a lot of attempts at the use of force, both within what we call cancel culture and the opponents of cancel culture. They're both attempting to use force. If you look at my Twitter, like yesterday, I tweeted about something from Andrew Sullivan, who's a really vocal opponent of cancel culture, who wrote this piece that I think was an attempt at the use of force, in which I tweeted at Andrew Sullivan saying, don't do this. This isn't how you defend liberalism. You're using force. You're not using reason and argument. Okay, so yes, I do see it in all of the sort of culture wars. Culture wars essentially involve an attempt to deploy ideas in a way where that's a use of force. And I take it to be my moral obligation not to participate in that. But social media more generally, right? I think you're right. Like if I'm on Twitter, right? And so like, I say things and then some of the things get like a lot of likes and some of them get fewer likes. And, what if people are more likely to believe the things I say when they have a lot of likes? That might be, I don't know. So I don't take that to be my responsibility, like as long as I'm not trying to bring that result about. And one thing I do is I think as a Twitter user, I do see it as my moral obligation to like tweets that I disagree with when I think they're making a good point. That is, I shouldn't just be using my likes to express agreement, because I shouldn't be promoting a culture in which people form their beliefs on the basis of there being a lot of other people who believe something. The lucky thing about social media in a way is that, like, you know, a certain view will have 1 million likes, and then the opposite view will also have 1 million likes if it's expressed in a kind of rhetorically evocative way. So on the other hand, the rhetorically evocative way is where you get some of the use of force. So yeah, I think this is a big problem in social media, that there is a lot of attempts to use force to manage disagreements instead of argument. However, I also think that social media is like kind of the first time humanity's tried to have a large scale conversation, and that's incredible. Like, it's amazing that we're doing that. I'm so excited that I'm part of it. And, you know, I take it to be my duty to try to be part of that and try to like conduct my part of it as well as I can, and hope that other people will, hope that we'll eventually learn how to do this thing. I view this as a very early time in the use of social media, right? Humanity will have, I think, something like social media for the next 100,000, you know, however long we last. I think we're going to have something like this. And this, right now, we're at the worst part. This is the very worst part of social media. It's only, in my view, it's optimistic. It's going to get better from here as we learn how to do this thing, which we haven't learned how to do yet. So rather than defecting from it and holding myself pure and being like, I'm not going to participate in that, my approach is to participate in it, but to try to, like, you know, do it the way that I think a philosopher should do it, which is to say, producing arguments and listening to other people who make good arguments against me. Okay. Rohan again. How could we work toward resolving the lack of political debate, which has been shunned in favor of labeling the other party as being in bad faith, as you mentioned? Oh, such a big problem. So let me say something which might surprise you. I don't like debate, and I don't believe in it. You might say, wait a minute, that just goes against everything you said. So if you look at Socrates' dialogues, there's not debate. What there is one person saying something and the other person trying to show them that they're wrong. That's what I think we need. And that's not a debate. Because if you think about what a debate is, think about, you know, the one presidential debate that we had. In a way, it wasn't that different from 2 town halls, just interspliced, right? Each person is trying to put themselves forward as the better one. And then there's like an audience that's watching. That's what a debate is. A debate is a spectacle in which people, you know, 2 or more views are like combating each other. But I think what we need is one view, right? And then somebody trying to show that person that they're wrong. So there's only one view on the table in a Socratic conversation. I think we need to have more of those sorts of conversations. So when people argue with me on Twitter and they're like, hey, this is why you're wrong, whatever, that's doing me a big favor, right? They're helping me, and I try to help other people by trying to show them that they're wrong. So I think we need to have more disagreements. And a disagreement is a situation in which you're trying to show someone that they're wrong. And, you know, you don't bring like all of your views into it. Your views don't matter. What matters is that they're wrong. So it involves a certain kind of altruism. So I think the first step of improving political discourse would be not pitching debates as the only or main. It's not that I think debates are terrible, right? But they're not actual solutions to the problem. The actual solution is a conversation or disagreement, right? That aims at, in some sense, refutation, disproving someone, not aims at promoting your own view. Right? So how can we promote those? I think just by doing it, like by, you know, trying to show people that they're wrong, and being as judicious and polite as possible when they get offended by that, because they should get angry. Anger's fine, right? You know, if they lash out at you, so occasionally, actually quite rarely, occasionally people on my Twitter talk in ways that I think are nasty. And I tell them that. I'm like, don't talk like that. That's not appropriate, right? But, you know, anything short of like insulting language or whatever, I'm like, okay, maybe it's a good argument. I should listen to it. So I think that, I think the idea that like, political discourse is irremediably just broken and there's nothing we can do about it is just a version of the same avoidance. Like, no, we just have to participate in it. And social media gives us an opportunity to do it, but also the people around us are an opportunity to do it. So take every opportunity that you have to show people that they're wrong is the advice that I would give if you want to promote rational discourse. Okay, do you think echo chambers contribute to more questions becoming angry questions? Yeah, good. So this is a great question, is like, how many of our questions should be angry, right? I am interested in a lot of things, and I don't only ask these sorts of questions. I ask lots of other kinds of questions too all the time. And I do think that one of the problems that we have is that too many of our questions are angry questions, interestingly. So I think it's like, this is an example that's maybe not going to register with you guys because you're a bit young for it, but like, oh, if you've ever been, okay, no, you can do it with your parents. I was thinking about it in the context of a marriage, but a relationship, but like, if you've ever been in a relationship, maybe with your parents or a sibling, where sort of you're fighting over everything. And what happens is every little thing gets sort of like symbolically attracted into the fundamental dispute, right? So that like, oh, why'd you leave your stuff lying there? Or why didn't you do the dishes? Right? And I think what's happening there is that the unwillingness to have the disagreement manifests in the form of the disagreement occupying more and more territory. And I think that's what's happened in politics. We have some fundamental disputes, some fundamental ethical disputes right now, that are alive in our culture. We are afraid to have them. We're afraid to have the conversations. And so that conversation sort of starts to grow and take over space. I think that it's, in a way, it's not the echo chamber. The echo chamber is the result of the same thing. The echo chamber is people banding together with the people who agree with them so that they can protect themselves from having the disagreements with the people who disagree with them. And I think that does result in this kind of almost like infection, right? Where in some sense, these questions are so important to us, we're not able to set them aside. And so they come back to haunt us. Andy asks, do you think that social media has worsened the conversations that we have and the disagreements that we have? I would say too soon to tell, like in some way, what social media has done is put us in conversation with one another much, much more than we were. So the people who are having conversations with one another wouldn't have had any conversations with one another before social media. So it's not like they would have had better ones, right? They just wouldn't have had them. And so what social media has done is it has brought into existence a whole bunch of conversations that didn't exist before. And now, so I think the right question is not, has it improved or made worse our conversations, but would we be better off without having those conversations? A lot of those conversations seem to cause a lot of suffering on all sides, and people don't seem to feel like they, lead to in understanding or enlightenment on either side, right? So let's just posit that they're maybe not good conversations. And I guess, I think it's sort of the jury is still out, because like, if I'm right that that we are just at the early stages, then those are like, we're doing something that we're not good at. And so we're doing it badly. And maybe we were better off when we weren't doing it at all. But if we get better and better at it, then it'll have been worthwhile. Like over the summer, I read the autobiography of Booker T. Washington. And he talks about how when the slaves were freed, like they were initially jubilant. And then like shortly thereafter, they were kind of at a loss. Like they had these lives and they seemed less happy than they were when they were enslaved. Eventually that changed, right? But like, there was like this period of like not knowing what to do with one's freedom. And I guess I see us as being a bit in that period. And there's a question, do we learn how to use our freedom or not? And, you know, my question is less like predictive than agential. Like, I think it's our job to make sure that we do learn how to use that freedom. Okay. Suppose 49% of people want lower taxes, 51% of people want higher taxes, and candidate A, who wants lower taxes, is elected by a democracy. Would candidate A's election be justified since their election does not resolve the issue, but simply paints it over with the might of the majority? So I think that this, the question's a great question, of the might of the majority is like a really deep one about democracy, right? So democracy in some sense is a government that involves the use of force. There's a version of democracy maybe that wouldn't, where we would deliberate over every question. So like, and some bits of democracy are like that. You know, in my my department, we have like philosophy department at the University of Chicago. We have faculty meetings where we have to decide things. We have to decide which graduate students to admit, who to hire, how to change our graduate program, how to change our undergraduate program, right? And we decide these things by having conversations. And I'm like, here's the change that I think we need. And there's like 3 people in the room who are like, no, I don't think we should have that change. I think that's going to screw things up. And then I'm like, well, here's why I think is actually a good idea. And like, they try to show me why I'm wrong. And like, basically we just try to figure out who's right. And that's a kind of democracy, right? But at the national level, we don't have that. It doesn't seem practical yet. Okay. And so there might be these disputes, right, that exist that have not been resolved, which is to say, we don't know the right answer. So we don't know whether we should raise taxes or not. And I think if 1% of people want the opposite, we don't know the right answer. Because if we knew it, we could persuade that person. But I think, you know, sometimes one needs to act. And so what I would say is that a democracy is a form of government that views the use of force in that situation to be justified. And that's one of the cases where the question of the use of force is actually resolved by the government. That is that point, that thing I made earlier about the government has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, right? I think, yeah, I think the idea of a democracy is just the idea that that use of force is justified, which is fine. Like, that's fine. But one thing one should note there is that one is not achieving justice, right? One has given up on the project of justice as being perhaps impractical, but the project of justice would be that of resolving the disagreement. Okay. That's the last question that I had. Any more questions? In your opinion, is any government better than another or any at all? Some government is better than no government. I take that to be the first truth. Someday maybe you guys will read Aristotle's Politics. I take that to be the most fundamental claim in the Politics. And like, you know, Aristotle lived through a whole bunch of political instability. Political instability is like a really nice word for it, right? It's like where your world falls apart every 20 years. And so his view was like, you know, even a tyranny, even a totally oppressive, tyrannical, autocratic government is like so much better than everybody killing each other in the streets. So his, like, that move to just government over no government was like, is like the big, and then like to get from that to like democracy is like, from Aristotle's point of view, like that's, yeah, okay. Or maybe, well, he didn't think democracy was best form of government, but his own best form, which is kind of a republic. He's like, that's small, those are small claims there. The question is like, do you have a government or not? And like, you know, through a lot of human history, just having stable government was like a major achievement. We've had stable government in our country for, you know, a really long time, probably way longer than the founders of our government predicted that we would, right? So I would say first, yeah, having government of some kind is crucial. And then I think that in terms of which kind of government is better, that's hard. And I've read a lot of philosophers talking about this question. You know, Plato thinks it's the rule of philosophers, of course. Aristotle thinks it's a certain kind of republic in which the citizens take turns ruling and being ruled, right? So in his form of government, like, we have a democracy where we choose, a representative democracy where we choose the leaders. Aristotle would say that we're basically enslaved in a certain way because most of us don't get to rule. We don't get to be president. In his republic, everybody has to rule in order to like be legitimately political. So he had a much higher standard in some sense of like how much politics ordinary citizens have to engage in. So these are like, Plato and Aristotle didn't think of democracy as being the best form of government. I think I just don't know the answer. Like I have not spent that much time in my life thinking about politics in that way, and I'm kind of open. I feel like I reflexively answer democracy out of allegiance to the system that I'm a part of and appreciation of its virtues. But I think that that's a lot of my answer. So I'm hesitant in saying, like, I'm better in saying, why does Plato prefer this? Why does Aristotle prefer this? Than giving my own answer. And I'm sort of open to alternative answers. I think it's an interesting question. Any more questions? I'll wait.
I'm probably gonna jump in here with a few questions. Some
Great.
people might, if there's no others, like obviously as host, I have a duty to step down if anything like pops up in Q&A. But my first thing, this may be predictable, but what do you think of, a certain famous example of anger and execution, Miletus and Socrates? Like, what do you think? How do you think when? I believe he was like a poet, right? And he got offended at something Socrates said about poets and was worried about the corruption of the youth. How do you classify that question, like moral outrage on the degeneration of society or moral outrage at someone challenging your power? Or kind of like, how do you characterize that whole situation?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right, that Socrates, I do think Plato wrote Socrates' apology to give us a illustration of how one should respond in that situation. And Socrates doesn't get angry. Right. What he thinks is that he thinks he has a fundamental ethical disagreement with Miletus. He thinks that they disagree over very important things. But Socrates, interestingly, kind of doesn't take himself to know the answer either, and what he ends up doing is trying to have a conversation with Miletus in the apology, right? Be like, okay, let's refute this. Let me try to refute you. So I think that there's something weird, almost like weird about Socrates, that he doesn't seem to get angry. He was a strange person. But I think that, in effect, whether or not he gets angry, the crucial part of his response is that he tries to refute Miletus, that he tries to show Miletus that he was wrong by asking him questions that are designed to bring out that Miletus hasn't actually thought seriously about what justice and injustice are and how you should respond to somebody who's unjust. And the fact that what you should actually do if somebody is unjust is educate them because they're ignorant about the most important thing, right? And that's what the conversation between Socrates and Miletus is about. So it's sort of reflexively about itself in this weird way. And so I think that, if people are angry at you because they want to challenge your power, because they're angry because you've exposed their weakness, like a lot of those cases are cases where we're inclined to think, well, in that case, now you have some special sanction to use some kind of force against them. And I think Socrates would say, no, I don't have any sanction. I have the same strategy, the same options as I have ever had, which is to try to persuade the person that they're wrong. And so, like, it's not any different from any of the other cases. The only way to resolve injustice, I think Socrates thinks, is through education, in effect. because injustice is just an error in someone's soul about a moral question. So you can't solve that by doing anything except talking to them. So that's your first question.
Awesome. So everyone, thank you so much for attending. It's been lovely to have you, especially if you've attended more than one talk. Please fill out this feedback form that I'm going to send out for next year's PhilCon. We really want to get some of the user feedback so we can make this even better for you all. Thank you so much for coming to speak, Dr. Callard. This has been fascinating. I and some other people probably have some more questions for you, but participants can stay or leave. I think we're just on time, so feel free to duck out, people, or feel free to chill and stay for a bit longer if you have thoughts to give to the Philosophy Club or Callard or whoever you want. So yeah, everyone, thank you once again. Dr. Callard, if you want to put your Twitter handles or maybe your website or email or whatever modes of communication if people have further questions, if that's something you would like to do, that could be cool. Yeah.
That's my Twitter. And you know what, if you go to my Twitter, there's a link to my UChicago webpage and my column and all this other stuff. So it's easy, that's easy. And if you're not on Twitter, you can still go to that page and see those things.
I think you sent that to the panelists only and not the panelists.
Oh, I see. Sorry, you are correct. To all panelists and attendees. Okay. It's just my name, my Twitter handle. So if you forget this, you can just remember using my name. But yeah, I should go in about like between 5 and 10 minutes, but if there's a few more questions, I'm happy to take them.
I'm just going to be selfish again and butt in here. You mentioned like Nietzsche earlier in the talk, and I'm just doing I've been reading too much of him lately because I'm doing like year-long thing on him. But I was wondering, since you seem to mention that we get angry because of morality, but have you considered, as I'm sure you have, if it's the reverse, that morality is a function of anger and not the other way around? I'm just curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think Nietzsche is one of the deepest thinkers on the question of anger, and he's someone that I definitely go to. I think he really, really understands revenge in a way that maybe nobody else has ever had in history. He's the best theorist of revenge. And, you know, his theory of punishment, which is fascinating, is just that we have a basic desire to inflict pain on other people. That's something that we value, but we view it as impermissible under most circumstances. And that in some sense, we've like invented morality to create a set of excuses to cause people pain. And so, you know, we think like killing someone, that's like evil and wrong. But like if they killed a whole bunch of people, now it's suddenly this great, awesome, wonderful thing to do, right? So it's like, finally, we can kill some people and call ourselves good. And so I think he's onto something there, but I don't think he's completely right. That is, I'm less cynical about morality than Nietzsche is. And ultimately, I think Nietzsche is less cynical about morality than Nietzsche is. That is, just a lot of the kind of normative stuff that Nietzsche wants to do, where he wants you to like not be a sheep and live in one way rather than another way. And it doesn't make any sense unless there's something like an ethical system where you can go right or wrong and do things better or worse, right? So I think Nietzsche himself ends up getting kind of captured by his own cynicism that doesn't make sense of Nietzscheanism. So my view is Nietzsche is right that we take pleasure in hurting people when we enact revenge. And he is right that much of what falls under the ethics of punishment are just ways of using nice language to cover over the fact that we are taking pleasure in the pain of others. But I think that a big part of that pleasure is the way it allows us to escape from our own anger. That is, it's a relief. It's not just that we happen to enjoy the suffering of others. It's that there's this incredible relief that brings to us when we no longer have to be angry. So my view would be it's a distinctive kind of pleasure, namely the pleasure of relief from anger. And that's why we don't take pleasure when we just see random suffering. It's not just that we don't permit ourselves. It's that suffering doesn't actually serve the psychological function that the revenge does, where it's like, it feels like a release valve or something has been let go. So I think his view is too broad, but it's correct for in a narrowed version. And and that is part and parcel of me thinking that our moral disputes are over things that actually do matter. That is, we're not wrong in thinking they matter. They actually do matter. That's a way of saying that morality is something real. And so there is something we're arguing about. We're right to argue about it. Yeah.
Awesome. I know you said you had to go, so have an amazing day.
Thank you.
Again, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I really enjoyed your talk, and we'll give you your gift very, very shortly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming.
Yeah, it was really fun to hold this, and I think it's historic. I hope that you had fun too. So have a
I did. Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
very much.